Welcome to Quilting's first reality show, live and unscripted with Susan Smith.
Hello, my quilting friends, and welcome. I am Susan Smith. You are in my studio, Stitched by Susan, and welcome to our virtual quilting bee. I call these episodes live and unscripted because they are being aired in real time, live streaming. Though you may be watching the replay, it was aired initially in real time. So I do this because as a novice quilter, boy, I wish I had, someone's shoulder I could look over to see how long things really took, to see some of the decisions that are made, to see if there are rights and wrongs, whatever. So I do these episodes for your benefit, hopefully, so that you can see the process in real time. And today's project is a freehand, edge-to-edge quilting design. Often I do these designs or these quilts, the project right from the beginning, right from the loading, and talk about that loading process as I go, and then on into the quilting and thread choices and etc. But today, because it is a fairly large quilt and I knew I could not get the whole thing done in a practical amount of time, I kind of turned it on its head, and I've already loaded and partially quilted the project, and now we're going to be starting in the middle and working the final end. So you get to see the last pass and the final bit of basting. And I'll be talking more about topics that are kind of apply to the middle of the quilt, to the process. So if you have missed previous episodes or want to see some examples of loading the quilt, then just go back to a couple earlier ones. I know that the very last one, which was the friendship quilt, I focused on the loading process, and in a lot of them I do. So you can find that in other episodes if you're interested in knowing how I load. So, a couple things before we dive into the quilting. Number one is, late in October, I'm going to be opening the registration again for my freehand quilting masterclass. This is a comprehensive, online, on-demand course on the style of quilting that I'll be doing today. All freehand and mostly edge-to-edge, so the same design across an entire quilt top. This is what is most commonly done by quilters for, quilts that are to be used, couch quilts, graduation quilts, baby quilts, sometimes even wedding quilts. So really, really useful. So it's just over 30 different designs are presented in this masterclass, so that at the end of it, you have a repertoire of feminine designs and masculine designs and geometric designs and contemporary and feathers and all those things. And I dive, because this is who I am, I dive into not only doing XYZ design from A to B, but my thought processes. So how do I develop those skills? How do I develop those motions? How do I develop, in fact, the design from an idea that I see? A little later in this episode, I'll be showing you where the idea came from for the one that I'm doing today. So in the masterclass, then I talk through that process of how I take something I saw in a rug or on wallpaper and create a continuous line quilting design that I can repeat out of it. So that's coming up in late October. But leading up to it, I'm also going to have a workshop. I'm also going to be coming onto YouTube, not necessarily Facebook, though you may be watching there today, but on YouTube live every day for a month. So I'm going to be starting that next week, probably Monday. What date is Monday, hon? About the 25th, I think that would be, of September. So watch for that. The rest of September and well into October, I'm going to be coming on live every day, mostly in the mornings. I can't give you an exact time because I'll be doing it. It relates often to what I'm doing that day, right? So the quilt that I've got loaded, or the project that I'm working on, or the thread choice that I'm making, or how I move my feet when I quilt, all kinds of quilting related topics. So watch for those live. I encourage you to, if you're interested in this style of quilting, first off, like and subscribe to this channel. And secondly, click the bell. Then YouTube will notify you when I do go live. So I try and set it up about a half an hour in advance so that you have a minute to get yourself together or get home from your errands or whatever you need to do to watch it. But if you click that bell, then YouTube will notify you whenever I'm going live, okay? So that's coming up starting next Monday. I think Monday or Tuesday. Let's see what else. I wanted to mention too, the YouTube channel. Hopefully this is super helpful information for you. I aim to be as practical as I can in these quilting episodes. And they're free for everyone. Whatever you can glean from this, if you can figure out the designs from what I show, all this material is free for you to use. But if you want to support the channel, you can do that very easily by going to buymeacoffee.com/stitched by Susan. And there, for as little as a one-time donation of $5, you can support the show. Everything that comes in through that Buy Me a Coffee program, we put toward upgrading our equipment in the studio, our recording equipment, cameras, lights, tripods, computers, etc. So you all have been so very, very generous in supporting us so far. And at the end of the show, Mr. Producer has made rolling credits now, and the names of those who are members in that coffee group are featured there, because we appreciate your generosity. So again, you can do as little as $5 one time. You can choose to do $5 each month, entirely up to you. So that is great. Also, some credit is due Mr. Producer, who sits behind the scenes and keeps all the balls juggled, keeps all the things happening. There he is. Gosh, I sure appreciate his help. This is absolutely not something that I could do on my own, and not even something I would want to. I don't love the technical side of things, but he does. So it's a great thing. And also our son Will, who does the introductory voices all the time. Yeah, I so enjoy them, and we have some more in the works. So look forward to some more kind of semi-comedic introductions. And lastly, but not least, our good friend Dan Unger, who provides the guitar music that we play throughout the show. We are so appreciative that he lets us use that. I know lots of you enjoy it, ask about it. It's not available for purchase, I'm sorry. You just have to come back and listen to the show. So thanks to Dan for that. All right, I think we're ready to get started, and I'll do some more chatting about things as we get on into the show, but that will get us going. Okay, today, let's maybe show a close-up design, and I'll show you some of the quilting I've already done. Close-up cam is coming. There we go. Can you see that? So I call this design, my husband is saying, move more slowly. Okay, can you see it? So Dave's going to put a picture up on the screen, which is my inspiration for this design. And I wanted to show
Redo all that because they lost sound. I had you muted. I'm sorry.
So from where? From where you put up the photograph? Okay. Deep breath. Let's start that again. Okay. The photograph that you see on the screen is of a paper napkin in my kitchen. And this was my inspiration for this design a couple of years ago. And you'll see as I quilt it, it's exactly like this. It's loop-de-loop, and it's echoes around the loops. Those of you who have been in the quilting world for a while might have seen a digital pantograph, also available and very similar, that's called, I think, Knit One Purl Two. And the designer of that, I don't know where her inspiration came from, perhaps from a paper napkin too, or paper towels, which I've seen some with similar designs. I just wanted to show you this one and to encourage you that, I don't know what I'm saying, there's sort of nothing new under the sun. And all of us are free to find our inspiration wherever we can and to put our own spin on it. So this is my spin on the paper napkin. I call it filaments because to me it looks a little bit like the filaments in an old-fashioned light bulb. So there's that. Okay. Oh yeah, next picture. I have one more picture for you. Those of you who watch often know that I often quilt in my bare feet. But today I'm wearing socks because one of my friends gave me presser foot socks. Can you believe it? What could be cuter for someone who's sewing? So that's what I'm wearing on my feet today. All right, you guys, let's get quilting. I am sewing today on my Bernina Q24. I'm finding where I left off here. I have got Isacord 40 weight thread loaded, and it's a very, very, very pale aqua, much like this background that I'm quilting on. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is this background fabric that is featured throughout the quilt is actually a linen blend. And I don't know if you've ever used that in a quilt, but I sure love it. It washes up into the cuddliest, softest feel. I just love it. Okay, now I got to get my thoughts together, okay? Pay attention to the quilting. I do have my stitch regulator on. That's why you're seeing the little red lights. Those are my under the presser foot cameras, little pair of red lights. Often when I'm doing edge-to-edge work like this, I like to quilt in the unregulated or manual mode. But for today's purposes, I chose to leave the regulator on because this quilt has quite a few bulky and thick seams. And so I really have to slow down to go over those. So for that reason, I chose to leave the regulated on so that I can easily make that adjustment wherever I need to. In my freehand, oh, and I just broke thread. Well, I wonder if we're at the end of the bobbin thread. That's what I wonder. Sometimes it pops the needle thread when you're at the end of the bobbin. Let's just have a look. And then I'll come back to my comment in a moment. So I always say when I break thread, the first time it happens, I think, you know, it just happens every once in a while. It does just happen. When it happens more than once, then I start looking for deeper reasons. So this time we're going to check the bobbin first and see if that's the deep reason. Let's get the needle threaded. I have a new needle threader on my machine and it sometimes hangs on to the thread really hard. No, we still have bobbin thread. Okay. So let's just scooch off to the side and see what we can see about that. Oh, I've got my water cup in the way, my coffee mug in the way. There we go. We are very nearly at the end of the bobbin, so I'm going to go ahead and change it out, although I don't think that's what caused the breakage. So we'll keep our eyes peeled for what's happening next. Meantime, I'll go ahead and put a fresh bobbin in because I'm within just maybe 5 or 6 yards of the end on that bobbin. And it does sometimes happen, by the way, you know, when you're winding a bobbin, you'll see as I begin it, it has kind of an overlap. So the last quite a few revolutions are not going to unwind smoothly. And because I choose usually to just let my bobbins run out, it often comes to that overlap point with a jerk and breaks my top thread. That's just the price I pay for choosing to run my bobbins that way. It's not the end of the world. Okay, fresh bobbin is in. And before you ask, no, I didn't check the tension. I've been better about using my TOA gauge, but so often I take the shortcut. So all I'm doing now, you guys, is backing up a little bit to a point and to where I see good tension on the quilting that I had before. Especially when you're coming to the end of a bobbin, you will have a few inches of awkward tension at the end of it, and so I like to undo that and proceed forward from where the tension was good. And what I'm doing now then is just overlapping about a 1/4 inch of what was stitched before so that I secure those tails. And I managed to make my stitch not in a very neat place. Let's try that again. I want it to line up. And then I'm just going to do a couple of close, tight stitches. And by close, I mean I've got my 5 stitches in less than 1/8 of an inch. So that's like a little lock that secures that stitching. And I'll come back in a moment and trim my threads out right now. And you can see that little splice is not very noticeable at all. So that's how I typically do it in the middle of an edge-to-edge type project. It's a simple, easy way of splicing your thread whenever you need to. I have no idea what I was talking about before that happened, so we'll just move on to other things. Oh, you know what? I do remember what it was. In the Freehand Quilting Masterclass, one of the things I talk about is, first off, how much quilting freehand is like handwriting. And secondly, how much you can be practicing in your day-to-day quilting like this. You can be practicing all the skills that you need for high-end custom quilting. So this design is a great example of that, because this shape is one that repeats a lot in quilting. It's like a cursive L or E shape. And so you can do a whole quilt of practice on that shape, and you know you're going to get better at it. And by the way, I just see right here, I've advanced my quilt a tiny bit too far. I'm not going to be able to reach up to the top. So I'm just walking to the other end and pulling my quilt back about an inch or inch and a half. I just overshot that a little bit. But you can see how quilting this type of design is literally giving you practice without having a practice sandwich per se. You're getting all the practice you need in this E and L shape. And when you go to quilt, say in some flying geese, you're doing some lovely loopy designs like this, you're going to find that you've had tons of practice doing that, and they'll be nice and uniform and lovely. And I feel like doing this type of edge-to-edge quilting on a regular basis will give you pretty much all the practice you need to be able to fine-tune your quilting skills. But I do think it's beneficial to pay attention then when you're quilting. Quilt with intention, quilt with care. Be working on making smooth and graceful and consistent L shapes rather than just slapping it out. Do you know what I mean? Think of it as a practice session. Think of it as perfecting your golf swing. It's a little bit like that, isn't it? If yours are looking squared off, then practice making them rounder. If yours are unevenly spaced, work on that spacing. Whatever the thing is that you see could use improvement, you've got a whole quilt to practice it on. This quilt, by the way, is made by my client Jane. Jane is a very experienced quilter, so she took the original pattern, which is called the Penny Sampler. I can't off the top of my head think of the pattern designer's name, but I did put it in the description of this episode, so you can look that up if you'd like. But Jane took it and personalized it, so some of the blocks that are in it were not in that original quilt. She has added them from other sources to very much make this her own. For example, there's a bicycle in this quilt, and her husband is an avid cyclist, and so that was a personal touch for her to add that bicycle. So we're nearing the end here of one of the passes. So I will take some time as I advance the quilt to take your questions. I forgot to add, if you would take a moment when you're asking a question to put the letter Q in front of it, then Mr. Producer has a much easier time finding them. When there are a lot of comments, it can be difficult to find, but he can search then for the letter Q, which is not in most of your comments, only in your questions. So in order to advance, I'm taking off all my apparatus that's holding the quilt square and smooth and rolling it up. You get to see some of those cute blocks as I go by. So this, by the way, is the end of the quilt right here. Not sure which camera I'm on, hon. Can't see it. There we go. All right, this is the edge of the quilt right here. So we don't have tons and tons more quilting to do. I am doing what is called floating the top. because clearly it's floating and not attached. It's my personal preference. There's more than one way to load a quilt on the long arm. Neither one right nor wrong, but I like to float. It saves time in loading for one thing, because I don't have to roll it at the other end. It gives me the freedom to make adjustments as I quilt. And it's just really efficient, I think. But steps need to be taken to keep a square quilt. So here are several of them. One of them is, as I'm quilting, the quilted portion tends to pull in a little bit. So when I look at where I want to baste on this side, it's kind of angling a little. So I actually will kind of work my quilt roll. Tug on it, squeeze on it. One of my quilter friends calls that milking. I'm not sure why. Milking the quilt roll to get that over. Another is, in this particular instance, can we even see it here? Kind of. There's a ton of excess hanging on this end. Does the other camera catch the edge here, Dave, at all? It does not. Well, I'm going to tell you about it. I'm grabbing... Okay, hang on. Mr. Producer, sir, is bringing another camera over here, because I'm going to show you some neat tricks here. 2 neat tricks. That'll do it. So see how this is kind of loose and saggy, because there's quite a bit. There's more than 14 inches of quilt backing here, and it's getting loose because there's no batting in the roll, right? An easy way to fix that is to just grab the top layer of it, pull it snug, and just wrap it around and tuck it in under that roll. Makes it so much easier. It lays flatter. It enables you to attach your side clamp much easier. It's just smoother and flatter in every way. Another tip. This edge right here, as you can see, is bias. All these edges are bias. And can you see there's a little bit of excess there? I do not want to pull that out and smooth it. I want to be judging how this is hanging so that it's not stretched and frowning down. Does that make sense? So I'm just zhuzhing, my favorite word, a little bit of it up into there, and I will baste that in. In fact, I'll do that right now. I do it by eye. If you're not comfortable doing that, drop a few pins in it so you know exactly where it's going to lie. And I also tend to baste this straight edge by eye, but if your machine has a channel lock, you can certainly use that. Mine is pretty good at stitching a straight line if I just gently pull it forward. You could also use a ruler for this if you want to be absolutely positive. Just tucking a seam allowance in underneath there. And can you see how I've just not allowed that bias edge to stretch at all? That is important for maintaining a square quilt. Keeping a square quilt is very much a cumulative process. It is possible to have a very square quilt come to you, as this one is. Jane's a beautiful piecer, and actually stretch it out and mess it up. And it's also possible to take a quilt that is rather wonky in shape and get it to be pretty square. And part of it is just this step by step, every time you do the pass, do the advance, assessing where you are, using the piecing lines as a straight guide, using the back roller as a straight guide, perhaps using your channel lock or ruler to keep things, 90-degree corners and straight sides and nothing stretched out. But if you address that with each and every pass, you can do a lot with a quilt, even one that's not square. This one happens to be beautifully square. The linen, though, is actually, it has a lot more give than cotton does. It's quite possible to stretch even a straight on-grain cut of linen way out of shape, just because it's a looser weave, I think. Okay, having done that, I will now put my, let me see, where can you guys see me? If I move Stella, you can see me on this side. Huh. I don't know if I can. It's tricky. So what I'm doing now is putting on my side clamps. I'm going to come down here. You guys have heard me talk about this. They're part of the Red Snapper system, their brand, and I think they're called Easy Clamps, or maybe Easy Side Clamps. But they have a little tiny narrow channel that the edge of the backing fits into. I like these clamps because when they close, they're such a slim profile. I'll show you what I mean in a sec. So I still attach my Bernina clamp to the side of it to hold it taut. I've got a real tangle going on over here with my mugs. I should move them. But this is what I love about these side clamps. They're such a slim profile that I can actually fit them between my presser foot and the base of my machine. Very cool. So let's put the clamp on the other side. And then we'll take a few questions before we go on quilting. How does that sound? Which side did I end on? This side. Okay, coffee mug in hand. I am prepared for some questions. Here they come. Laura, hi from Garland, Texas. Have you ever quilted a large pieced, no-pill fleece backing? Any tips? I have quilted fleece backings. Not on my own quilts, on clients, and usually they have opted to not put batting in them because they get quite thick and quite heavy, but I've not had any trouble doing them. I've not used a specialty needle or anything like that. My same, 100% poly thread in a medium weight, usually a 40 weight is what I have. That's my go-to, and it seems to work pretty well. Shauna, hello from Georgia. I'm new to long arming. What may be some causes of thread nests on the back of the quilt? Thanks for sharing your experiences. One of them, Shauna, is, did you know that when you start and stop, you always want to pull your bobbin thread to the top and hang on it? I'll show you when I start stitching. That's absolutely critical, and that may really help. Diane, what are the advantages to not using your stitch regulator? Oh, lots, Diane. And I've talked about this more in other episodes. Many quilters will say that the machine moves a little more smoothly when it's not putting its effort into trying to regulate the motor. It just makes it have a little bit of drag, a little bit of resistance. It's very small, but it does. So if you're doing something, like bubbles or something very smooth or very curvy, it can be smoother without the stitch regulator. I think that it's also very helpful for developing your quilting ability. So your control and just your smoothness of movement, because you have to learn how to not be jerky and surging. You have to learn to smooth out your quilting, so it can really help. The stitch regulator is great training wheels, and it's a great tool. So use it when you need to. I'm using it today because I know that I'm going to slow down and speed up for those bulky seams. But there's lots of advantages to quilting without one too. Jennifer, do you hold the button thread and top thread? The button thread, the bobbin thread you must mean. Yes, I do, and I will demonstrate my starting when I begin quilting. We'll take a close-up of that and show it really closely. Sue, I'm glad you're working on a sampler quilt. I have the hardest time figuring out how to do an edge-to-edge on samplers. So interesting, Sue, because when Jane first engaged me to do this quilt, she was looking for custom quilting, and I talked her right out of it. Only because it's a fairly busy quilt, and I don't know that the serious amount of time that it would take to quilt all these different blocks would make it look that much better. But, that's just my viewpoint. But anyway, Jane agreed to an edge-to-edge, so I'm happy about that. That's my happy place. Gail, is the TOA gauge worth the expense? Oh, great question, Gail. I think it is. I bought one actually some years into my quilting journey, because not only does it give you a number for your tension so that you know your bobbins are having a consistent, some are not tighter or looser than others or different types of thread, but also when you pull your thread through it, you can see if there's any unevenness within the bobbin itself. So if your gauge goes wong, 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 right? You know that it's not smooth. It should just pull out smoothly, and that gauge should register smoothness. That's why it felt like a worthwhile expense to me. On the other hand, I know quilters who have quilted for years without one and just done the dangle test. So maybe try one at a quilt shop, or maybe get them to demonstrate for you what they think the benefits are, and then you can decide if it's worth it in your framework. Six-pack, any idea what fabric line the backing is? Do you know, I don't have any clue. There is a selvage bottom and top, but of course I can't see either of them at the moment. So I'll try and remember to look afterwards and put it in the description. So if you think of it, come back and look after a day or so when I've had time to make those edits, and I'll try and put it in there for you. Do you ever use a 0 measuring tape to keep the top square? Actually, yes, I do. And I have one loaded on my quilting machine as we speak. There's a leveler bar, a dead bar that my quilt is going under and then rolling onto the take-up bar. And I've got my tape permanently affixed to that bar. So I can see it looking straight on. You guys can't see it as well on camera. Linda, I recently had spots mid-pass where there was a nest on the bottom and loose stitches on top along a curve. Any tips? Usually, Linda, it has to do either with poor needle or not necessarily tension, but incorrect threading. So, for example, if your top thread is not through the little spring that bobbles, the intermittent tension spring, correctly, that can affect how smoothly or not it's feeding through the needle. And that seems to be a common one for when you have tension that comes and goes. Does that make sense? You know, tension is good for a while and then you get a nest and then it's good again. Often has to do with threading, but sometimes just a new needle will fix that as well. Make sure the needle is also an appropriate size for the weight of thread that you're using. That has to do with that even flow as well. I'm frozen. What's happening? If you're still seeing, hang on for a second and we'll see what we can do. Oh, there we go. It's one camera and it's frozen. Oh boy. Okay, we're gonna go to a different camera view and then my husband will try and see if he can fix the camera, but I can't see the question, babe. Okay, just bear with me a second. Let's see, this will give you an opportunity to see some of the cute blocks. The fishing block, the bird block, the cloverleaf block. There are just so many cute ones in this quilt. Let's see. We've still got a frozen camera.
So are you able to see the question if I put it up?
Yes, I can. Okay, the question's coming up. Penny, what size clamps do you use? I have 19-inch side clamps on my machine, Penny, but that's because I have a 24-inch throat on my machine. These clamps also come in 16 and 12. So you want one that fills up most of your throat space, but not all, perhaps 3/4. And the beauty of them is, even a 12-inch would be okay on here. You get a nice, even grasp then of the edge of your quilt. I'm sorry, my hand is off the screen. You get a nice, even grasp and tension on it, as opposed to one clip pulling here and one clip pulling here. One of the reasons that I love them. Shall we start quilting and we can do that on the, is the close camera working? Oh, there is more questions. Okay. Terry, I see the swoon quilt behind you. I just got one in. Can you explain how you decided to custom quilt versus E2E? Sure, I can, Terry. For one thing, I did this swoon quilt in like my second year of long arming, so I was still experimenting with all kinds of stuff, and I did not yet know, honestly, that freehand and edge to edge was my love, was my happy place. I didn't know near as many designs, and also I really wanted to explore doing highly detailed custom quilting. I have found out that is not my love. I can do it. I do it sometimes, but I don't do it very often. But I did it on this quilt, and it was a great learning experience. If you look at the back of this one, there's a fair bit of poor tension on it. I was learning, and it was a great experience, and I learned a lot, and I'm not sorry I did it. And I don't know if I'd do it again. Lisa, I have a hexagon quilt to quilt. Would you suggest that I baste it all down before I do all the quilting to keep it square? Oh, that's a great question, Lisa. There are some quilters, Tia Curtis is among them, and she posts a number of videos where she does do all the basting before she starts quilting, even an edge-to-edge design. I personally do not, even for a hexagon quilt. There are enough straight edges in it that I can, when I advance my quilt, I can straighten things up and square up that one pass, put my clamps on the front that hold this front edge square and nothing shifts. That's my personal preference, is to still float it and square it up with each pass. I would try one and try the other. Maybe baste half the quilt and see how that works for you, and float the second half and see how that feels, and just see what works better for you. Pamela, which orientation do you load the backing? Does it change woven versus something like kinky or fireside? You know, it does a little bit. I know people talk about minky, for example. It has more stretch one way than the other. I tend to look, there's different factors. One will be if there's a seam in it. One will be if there are straight edges, because I need a straight edge on my first front edge that I'm loading. Another may be how the quilt fits it. Another may be whether the seam is oriented. You know, in this case, I've got a seam oriented crossways. If I had not been on camera with you guys, honestly, I'd have probably gone the other way because Jane's seam is beautifully flat and I would have had fewer passes if my quilt was loaded sideways. So there isn't a right wrong. Learn to not put too much tension on things like the fireside or the minky, and then I think you can load it either way. Just be cautious that you don't overstretch it. Do we have another question? We do. Mary Jordan, when using needle punch batting, I've found dimples up and pimples down makes a huge difference. How do you load your batting? Well, Mary, currently I'm using Hobbs 8020, which does not have a scrim on it. I think it is needle punched, but I don't find that I have an issue with it either way, quite honestly. And again, I just use fairly multi-purpose universal needles. I have a 9014 loaded right now. And I don't find that I have trouble with it. Some people have said they do with a batik, for example, you know, you get bearding in the back, and some people have said it really matters. I personally have not found that to be true. So, but if it's working for you, stick with what works for you and your machine. That's it for questions. Okay, you guys, let's get quilting. So I didn't really talk about these magnets, but I will for just a moment now. You saw me baste on my right side, baste on my left side, and because this edge is floating here and is not attached, I want to be sure that it does not pull up as I'm quilting in the middle, right? So that's what these magnetic bars do. My loading system means that there is no leader on this bar. There's only my quilt going over it, so there's not a lot of thick layers of fabric. So these magnetic hardware store variety bars just fit on the front, and that secures this front edge, so now nothing can shift in any way, and I'm free to quilt. All right, let's see our close-up camera, hun, and we're going to show how to pull up a thread. Let me clip off the tails from the last one. So here's how I do it. I'm hanging on to my top thread, my needle thread, okay? And I take one stitch. Your machine may have a different method than mine, but in mine I've got my one button set to take one stitch like this. Okay? So now I've got a bobbin loop. Can you even see that? It's such pale thread. I can either grab the loop and pull it, or if it's hard to pull, or if you don't have space under your presser foot like I do, you can take that top thread between both your hands and scoop, and it'll pull the bobbin thread right up. So now I've got them both here. Again, can you see them, I hope? I pull a bit of a tail, so I've got something to hang on to, and now I hang on to both. And in my mind, this is essential. Whether you're at a domestic machine or a long arm, it is 100%. You must pull up that bobbin thread and hang on to it. If you don't, you will get rat's nests on the back. There's just no way around it. So now that I'm hanging on to both, and you can wrap it around your finger, or you can put your hand on it firmly, or whatever you like. I just tend to grab it like that. Then I start stitching. And on my machine, again, I've got it set. It's just a programming for one of my buttons to take 4 short stitches. Now, the machine does not move on its own. I'll show you. It just takes the stitches. I purposely move my machine just a tiny touch as it's doing those stitches, because if they're all in the same hole, all I've got is threads twisted around each other. But if I make them be over a couple threads of my quilt, then I've got tight locking stitches. So that's my whole rationale. And I do the same thing sort of in reverse when I'm ending. When I'm done stitching, I'll do those short stitches, and then I'll pull up the bobbin thread, and if you guys remind me, I'll show you at the end. Pull up the bobbin thread again and clip it on this top edge so there's no tails down below. All right, let's get quilting. Oh, we've got our basting stitch still on. So funny, even with the not terribly big area to quilt today, I see that I'm talking myself right into a whole bunch of time. I am a talker, there's just no doubt about it. Just going to pause to pick up a thread before I quilt it in. I did mention to you that this design is called Filaments. It is not one that is included in my freehand quilting masterclass. It's one that I've developed since that class was recorded and released. But I do have one other avenue for learning if you're interested. I have a monthly subscription membership called Advance. And it is for machine quilters, both long arm and domestic, although most of my demos are at this time done on a long arm. But the designs hold true for both. But there's new content each month. I do at least 2 pieces of new content, and they're just additional quilt-related things. So sometimes there are new designs, and this is one of them that has been published in that monthly membership. Sometimes there are guest presenters, where the Freehand Quilting Masterclass has mostly edge-to-edge or all-over style quilting. In the advanced membership, I have a little more focus on custom work. And then also I do a number of, I call them case studies. So they are usually projects that come into my studio, usually client quilts, that have some sort of interesting feature or possibly challenge or particular technique. And so I'll film the steps that are involved in the making of that quilt, and then I'll release a case study, which just kind of walks you through. Here's how I handle this, and here's how I handle this. For example, one of the case studies was a quilt that was made by an artist, and she hand painted the fabric. So it was the process of quilting over that painting and how I designed that. Another one was a highly detailed custom quilt, and some of my tips for avoiding thread buildup, you know, for where lots of lines converged, for example. So that sort of thing. Anyway, if you're interested in that, also at the bottom of the description of this episode is a link to an informational page on that advanced membership. And I see I'm not gauging where I'm rolling my quilt very well. I again rolled too far. I'm going to not be able to reach quite to the top of that. I think that'll be enough. Perfect. Can you see how when I need to go to a different area, I just travel along my loops? That's the beauty of an echo. Here's this gorgeous linen. All this pale aqua is the linen blend. It's called Essex linen. I believe it's made by Robert Kaufman. And I think it's 55% linen and 45 cotton, right about half and half. But it does make the nicest quilts. It's a bit bulkier, is that the word I want? It has a bit more body than cotton does, so it doesn't press into quite as flat seams when you're sewing it. But when you use and wash the quilt, it washes up into this lovely, soft feel. I've made a couple of quilts using the Essex linen as the background fabric, the main fabric, and I love them. So once again, if this is the first time you're catching this live or the first time you're seeing the show, let me know what you think. But if you enjoy this style of presentation, very live, very unscripted, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell so you don't miss any future episodes. We try to air these about twice a month. And they're always on Friday, and they're always at 9 a.m. Pacific time. I do travel for Bernina these days to dealerships and to quilt trade shows. And so they are a little bit subject to my dates of travel, and in fact subject to what else is happening in my life sometimes. So we just try to do them twice a month. Speaking of what's happening in my life, last week we were moving my parents, who lived just a couple of miles on the Canadian side of the Canada-US border. And we helped them to move much further north, which is where most of my siblings live. And so my family at this end were the ones that were doing the packing and loading the U-Haul and so forth. So that was last week's project. But I'm happy to say we got it all done. They're installed in their new apartment. All went well. So this coming week, I did mention, starting, I believe on Monday, I'm going to be doing short live episodes every morning on YouTube. So again, you'll want to like and subscribe to the channel, and you'll especially want to hit the bell button for this, because they vary a little bit as to time of day. I try to make them in the morning, but because they are always relating to whatever I'm working on that day, sometimes that varies a bit. So I try to pick, you know, whether it's the choice of thread or the choice of design, or, as I said earlier, how I move my feet when I'm quilting, any quilt related topic. And I just talk about them, perhaps 10 minutes. So those will be happening every day starting next week and going for a full 30 days. While that's happening, we're heading to the Oregon coast for a week. It's our annual holiday with another couple, sometimes two couples, but this year just one other couple. And we love the Oregon coast in the fall. It is beautiful. It's not your sunny, beachy type weather, but it is your gorgeous scenery, pounding waves, walk on the beach type of holiday. So I'll be coming to you from the Oregon coast. But I'll still have quilty things to say. You know I will. So here's an example of these thick seams, you guys. And you see how I'm just slowing down, partially so that my machine has time to form good stitches, but also so that I'm sure not to push any of those bulky seams and distort them. And also you notice I am not avoiding or quilting around the bulky seams. This is my personal philosophy. The quilt lays better when it's finished if you quilt those bulky seams down, if you stitch right through them, or at least very, very close to them. So I purposely stitch on the bulky seams. If you stitch around them, a quarter or half of an inch, you're apt to get buttons in your finished quilt. When you release it off the long arm and the tension is gone, those bulky seams will stick right up if you've stitched around them. So I think stitching over them is the solution. One of the beauties, honestly, there was one right there. One of the beauties of quilting freehand is that you get to sort of fudge your stitching a little bit to hit those seams, because you have ultimate control over where your needle goes. And so you can adjust by 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch just so that you can catch those seams well. And that particular tip was a takeaway from another machine quilter. Her name is Jody Robinson, and then some years ago I was at one of her classes. And, up till that time I had seen other quilters, avoiding the bulky seams because it's hard to stitch through them, and if you do it fast you're apt to break a needle. And then Jody demonstrated for us, look at the difference when you stitch through them, how nicely it lays, and I agree. So ever since, that's been my philosophy too. For those of you who may just be tuning in, I am quilting on my Bernina Q24. This quilting is entirely freehand. There's no computer aid here, no paper pantograph. And it's my own design, and it's called Filaments. And it came to me courtesy of a paper napkin. That's where the idea came from. I'm using 100% polyester thread. The brand I have on today is Isocord, and it's a 40 weight. And it's in a very pale aqua color. See, here's a thick seam right here, and I'm going to purposely stitch right over that. You see that? And that will help it to be flat forever and ever in the quilt, and I like that look. Here's some thick seams too, right in the fish's little nose, and I'm just going to stitch right over them. And here again, see that thick one? I'm just going to make a tiny loop just so that I purposely catch that seam allowance and stitch it down securely. I briefly considered using a cup foot or spoon foot for this quilt. They're kind of a curved foot. In my machine, it's just something that you clip on. And it's about 1 inch around, and it's kind of acrylic, so it's semi-see-through, but not exactly clear. So I considered using it because it does really help to skate up over the bulky seams and not to push them out of the way. It goes over them more smoothly. But what you sacrifice for that is visibility. And I opted to keep the visibility. So those are just the choices you make with any given quilt. Which do you want more? The ability to skate over the seam allowances or the ability to see exactly where you're driving? And this is a very busy quilt with a number of busy prints and things going on, and also those seam allowances that I wanted to anchor. So to me, the visibility was the important choice. If I was working on, you know, perhaps a t-shirt quilt that just wasn't as fiddly, you know, maybe for a college kid or whatever, or had very few seams in it, and you just wanted to quilt the whole thing flat, that's when I would probably choose to use that spoon foot. It is really, really helpful for bulky seams. But I didn't think quite the right choice for today. Got some thread tails here I need to clip. We're nearing the end of this pass, so get your questions loaded in because I will stop and answer some again. And I will do my best to remember to show you how I end my thread also when I pause. And I usually try and pause with my needle down. I did not that last time. I don't know why, but sometimes when I'm talking, I hit the wrong button. You may be working on a very different machine than I am, so I don't go into too much detail about my buttons or how I program them, because different machines have different features in that way. But on a number of machines, you can, in fact, program certain buttons to do certain things, if indeed you have several buttons to choose from. So, you know, for mine, I have that single stitch button, and I have the lock stitch button, which does the 4 consecutive stitches, but I could program them to do other things. So I encourage you, if your machine does have multiple buttons, look into what things they can do for you and experiment with some of them. You might find something that's really helpful or lends itself particularly well to the style of quilting that you do. I have just this little edge here with not much quilting. We'll just do one more echo. And I'm on a print where you really can't see, so why don't I just lock my stitches and then I'll quilt off into the batting where you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so pretend I've reached the end of my seam and I want to end my stitching here. We're seeing the close-up view? Yeah, we are. So again, I've got my same button that does 4 consecutive stitches. And again, I'm going to move my machine just a touch. Do you see that? About 1/8 of an inch in total, so that they are very tiny lock stitches. Now I'm pulling my machine away a little, grabbing my top thread, just like I did at the beginning, taking 1 stitch, just like I did at the beginning. Now again, can you see it pulled up my bottom thread loop? Now I like to move away then because I'm going to pull on that loop till my bobbin thread is taut, but I want a tail on my bobbin thread underneath, ready to start my next stitching. If I were to just go right here and cut, my bobbin thread would be so short I couldn't grab it next time. So I move away before I cut. Now I've got my bobbin thread loop and my top thread tail all pulled snug, and I'm going to clip them right at the quilt surface. And you can see that makes a very neat ending. There is no thread stub on the bottom because I pulled it to the top. So it's just very neat. All your work, all your snipping is done on the surface that you can see on the top of the quilt. Alrighty. I'm going to take all the apparatus off and then we will stop for a couple of questions. I think that's the last time we need the magnets. I think we can get all the rest in the last roll. And I do, by the way, sometimes stop with my needle down and just roll it with the quilt. This one I chose not to do that because I'm finding that it is a little bit stretchy and I don't want that pulling to pull it out of shape. So it only takes a minute, honestly, to cut the thread. We can't do it quite all in one pass. Look at that. But I am going to go ahead and go far enough forward that I can baste the whole thing, and then I'll rewind a little bit to do the quilting. All right, let's take some questions before we baste. Main camera. Here we go. Let me get my water glass jug. This was from a couple of you that were watching, sent me this lovely insulated water cup. I love it. Mary, when using a needle punch batting, oh, we've done this one already, hon. Yep. I can't believe it, Mr. Producer. Doubled up on a question. Jennifer, when you run out of bobbin thread, how do you connect the threads again? That's the issue I always have. Do I rip some out and hold the bobbin thread? Where do you rip out? So probably I'm going to run out of bobbin thread before I'm done, so there will be a really good way to demonstrate that one. So you'll have a good chance to see it. But in general, I overlap about 1/4 inch of the previous stitching, and that locks the end of the last one and the new end of this one and holds it in place. And I've never had any trouble with that coming undone on quilts. Roberta, will you be at PIQF in October? No, I don't think so, Roberta. I don't think so. I'm at the Rusty Barn in, I can't think where it is, in the Everett area in December. M. Phipps, how much is your membership? It is $19.97 a month, and it's $197 for an annual one that lasts for 12 months. So you get about 2 months free if you do it that way. Marla, how do you know which foot and thread weight to use? The foot I don't think has much to do with the thread weight at all, Marla. The needle and the thread weight and perhaps your fabric are the things that match. I tend to go middle of the road because I'm doing these useful couch quilts, and I do quite a lot of them, and it's not fiddly quilting. I tend to have a 90-14 needle, which is neither huge nor tiny, and 40 weight thread, right, which is neither thick nor super thin, and that's my go-to. If you're going to use finer thread like a 60, a Glide 60 for example, or even an 80 weight, you know, you could probably get away with a smaller, finer needle perhaps. And if you're going to use thicker threads, you may need a more robust needle like a jeans needle. It's got a bigger eye as well. Most thread manufacturers and needle manufacturers will give you some guidelines for how to pair them up. Gail, recently started getting thread shredding. Could it be a sign of a timing issue? I've rethreaded, changed needle, etc. Not likely your timing, Gail. Timing is a thing quilters tend to blame stuff on it, but really, unless you've like hit a ruler or done something massive, it's not likely your timing. More likely to be possibly a bad spool of thread, but perhaps the wrong needle size so that it's pulling too tightly through the eye of the needle. So try a one size bigger needle and see if that helps. I think that'd be the easiest thing to try. Barbara, do you ever pause to check if your pattern is not going too much in one direction? I do, Barbara, and here's my kind of initial way of approaching that. I've only done a couple passes today, so you haven't seen it, but I always alternate my passes. So this last time I finished on my right-hand side, and now I'm going to start on the right and work left. And then the next time I'll start on the left and work right. And in that way, it keeps it looking pretty random. I've found that to work for me anyways. Savannah, Dave, did she say the quilt pattern would be under the YouTube video I'm watching on Facebook at the moment? It should be in both, Savannah. I believe I put the same description on both platforms, so you should be able to find, and it's called the Penny Sampler. I just can't remember the name of the designer off the top of my head. Joan, hi from Kennewick. How wide of a pattern are you stitching from top to bottom before moving over? That is so random, Joan. I'm moving around quite randomly. I do try and stitch what is further away from me before I fill in what's close to me, so I don't get an awkward corner up there that's hard to fill. But it just depends on how large in scale the design that I'm quilting, and I move randomly around. When I need to move to a new area, you know, and I see I'm getting myself painted into a corner, I just echo my way around, especially with this design because it's got echoes in it anyway. So no hard and fast rule, sorry. Okay, that's it for questions. Let us base the rest of our quilt. So I'm using a 1/4 inch basting stitch because I have that capability on my machine and I like that stitch. You certainly could base this just with your regular quilting stitch. I've done that many times too. I just visually gave a good check to this, that this side is straight and that my corner is lined up. But because there are bias edges and because of the stretchy quality of the linen, I am going to walk around my machine and go ahead and put my channel lock on for the bottom edge so that I'm confident that it is straight. Sometimes I do that by eye too, but it's just one more thing that we can do on purpose. Some machines have a button you can push for that. Some machines don't have a channel lock at all. So I don't know if that applies exactly to you, but for me, I just have to walk around my machine and flip a little lever. And I'm just feeling these seam allowances as I go. Some of them are pressed open and some of them are pressed to one side. So I'm trying to gauge, you know, which it is in that particular seam and continue that along the edge that I'm basting now. So this one was pressed to the side. And I know Jane, the maker, alternated back and forth between them just depending on what type of block she was piecing. The linen, as I mentioned, is a bit thicker, more body than cotton, so some of those seams she pressed open just to reduce the bulk, which is actually very fine. When you're quilting an edge-to-edge design, it makes no difference whether they're pressed open or to the side. And can you see how I'm just adjusting my fabric a little? Because I know I'm stitching in a straight line. If I see my quilt dipping below it, I just push it up a little. And that tiny bit of fullness will be taken up as I quilt the Filaments design. Here again, I just want to make sure that seam allowance is not turning. I'm trying to keep my basting stitching well within a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That way Jane does not have to undo it. It will just fall right within the binding seam. I have this same navy fabric. How fun. And if you're not comfortable with your fingers this close to the needle, by all means, take the time to pin things in place first. Whatever works for you. Oh, I flipped the wrong lever. I turned the other channel lock on instead of turning my first one off. Okay, now we're moving freely. No, we aren't. What have I done now? Now we're moving freely. I do know how to run my machine, you guys. Sometimes in the heat of thinking of all the things, your automatic motions become less automatic. So I'm going to leave needle down this time because I'm only moving it a couple of inches. You just need to rewind a little bit. There we go. So we don't need any magnets this time, but I will go ahead and put my side clamps on, and then I'll take another question or two before I get quilting. Just get these side clamps in place. For both the tension of my roll and the tension on my side clamps, all you need is enough tension to keep the quilt from sagging, drooping, wrinkling. You do not need to build a drum here. I have a cut edge on the side of this fabric, and it's just got a little bit of frayed bits. It's a little bit resistant to going into my channel here. Let's see. Pin to the rescue. I have a whole YouTube episode on this, by the way, you guys, on using these side clamps and ways to kind of coax your fabric in to the right channel. It can be tricky, and if I don't get it here pretty soon, I'm just going to put my easy clamps on. Pulling it tight is helpful. I think I got it. Using a pin to coax it in there is helpful. We got it. Success. Okay, we have a question or two? It's coming. There we go. M-Fips, how big are your loops? Oh boy. This actually brings us to a really good point. My loops, my initial ones are about 1.25 inches-ish. They vary a little, but something I have discovered, and I know other people do too, is that as you work your way down a quilt, some people tend to get larger and larger and larger as they're quilting. That's me, in a hurry to get done. My quilting gets bigger and looser as I go. Other people tend to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and tighter as they go. So here's a trick for you. I have my trusty plexiglass audition boards, I call them. If you haven't seen these before, they're awesome. Hardware stores will sell this 1/8 inch plexi, and if you can't find it at your local hardware store, I also have a link in the description for Amazon, sells them as well. So I use these when I'm trying out a new design, when I'm trying to decide the scale, right, how big or small I want to make a design on this quilt. And it's just a dry erase marker, and I use a piece of batting for my eraser. I've put tape around the edge of the board. It keeps me from inadvertently drawing off with my marker, and it marks top of the board. I never, ever, ever use the reverse side. I never want marker residue on my quilt. So all that said, early on in this quilt, can you see my little design on there? Early on, I actually took my marker and traced over some that I had quilted, so that I can actually look at this board from time to time and say, oh yeah, that's the size I was quilting those loops. And if I've gotten 1/2 inch bigger, I'll see it. And if I've gotten 1/2 inch smaller, I'll see it too. So I will often do this. A piece of paper would work too. I just like the plexi because you can see through and kind of trace over your quilting. But you could do it on a piece of paper too. When you begin the quilt with the scale you've decided on, and just keep that beside you and look at it with each pass. And that helps you to keep it consistent. Okay. Now then, remember I said that we switch sides, right? So we are going to, or alternate sides. So we are going to start on the right-hand side because that's where I ended. Let's just check the bobbin while we're here. Oh, there's still a bit on it. My usual method, for those of you who are regular watchers, you'll know my usual method is just to quilt till it runs out. But if I'm within just a very couple yards, then I will go ahead and change it while I'm at an edge. So again, I'm grasping my top thread. I took 1 stitch. I'm pulling up that bottom loop, which I didn't get. That didn't sound good. Hang on. Yep, see, something's wrong in the way I loaded that bobbin in. I can just tell the sound isn't quite right. So I'm just taking my bobbin out, re-putting it back in the bobbin case. I don't know, when that happens, I don't always know what it is that was wrong. I did not see anything wrong, but I could hear that it was not flowing smoothly. Okay, so let's do this start process again. I'm hanging onto the top thread. I take one stitch, and now I've got a loop of my bobbin thread. I can either grab it with my fingers or hook it with my top thread, and then I pull a long enough tail that I can hang on to it securely. Then I do my few short stitches in quick succession. And sometimes when I'm starting in the basting at the edge of the quilt, you know, I'll literally just turn my machine on and go, you know, buzz through a few stitches, because that's not going to show, right? When you're in the quilt, more important that you do neat ones in a specific place. But when you're on the edge, anything's possible. For those of you who own Berninas, Bernina machines are kind of famous for the fact that the bobbins start rattling as they get half empty or more. So it's kind of your clue. You can't really tell when it's going to run out, but when it's getting lower, you get the rattle. Don't know that you can hear it on camera, but I can hear it a little bit. They also rattle like that when you need to put a drop of oil in. So when I do change the bobbin, I will take a moment and drop some oil in there. I try to oil with most bobbin changes. I don't always remember, but with most bobbin changes, I will take the time to just put in one drop of oil. On this pass, I'm not going to worry as much about getting as far down on the front edge as I could, because I've got such a little bit left. You guys can actually see the bottom of it. I want enough room to maneuver when I come to do that last skinny pass. So this one's going to be partial in a way. I'm just going to get some of it across in the middle of this, what I've got exposed here in the quilt, and then go ahead and advance it. Some really thick seams here where this little plus sign is. I'm just using my fingers to kind of make sure that the seam allowances underneath are in fact laying down as flat as they can be. Like, I don't want them to be twisted under there. And when you have such close, tight seam allowances, that is a possibility. So I want to make sure that I keep that flat. And I just see that my thread has come out of one of my guides, so I'll stop and put that back in. I'm seriously thinking about doing a series of kind of shorty episodes and make like a playlist that's called Know Your Machine. I'm getting to know my Bernina very well, but I think a lot of these principles apply to any machine, and that was a great example of one. Like, know what your thread looks like as it's feeding through the thread guides on the top. This is true of your sewing machine as well. You know, if you see that thread almost flashing in front of your eyes, you're like, oh hey, that's come out of a thread guide somewhere. It shouldn't look like that. Know your machine. The sound of the bobbin, when it needs filling, when it needs oiling. Know your machine. if you guys have some ideas for that, or if you'd like to see that, let me know. I'd love to hear some more ideas for it. Or things you've noticed about your machine characteristics that just help you to shortcut problem solving, for example, because you know your machine. I feel like this whole row of little pluses is going to be a wee bit tricky. If you're enjoying this episode, I would love if you would hit that subscribe button. Like and subscribe. The thumbs up is very helpful too for getting this out to more quilters. And then also remember that I'm going to be going live each and every day starting next Monday for the remainder of September and most of October with a little quilting related topic each and every morning. So if you click the bell, YouTube will be kind enough to notify you every time I am live, because they're helpful that way. If you're looking for some easy listening while you're quilting, I do have a podcast. You can find all the episodes at podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. But I'm also in the process of uploading all those episodes actually to YouTube. So there's a playlist on my YouTube channel called Podcasts. And so it is still just audio in the sense that you don't see quilting, but you do see lots of pictures of quilts. They form the kind of background for the audio. But whichever way you prefer to listen or whichever platform you prefer to be on, all those episodes are there. And most of them are interview based, so they're conversations with other crafters, most often quilters, but I've had weavers and soap makers and other types of crafters on there as well. So most often they're conversations with other crafty people talking about their journey, talking about what a difference their craft has made in their life, talking about what's meaningful, what they've learned, all those sorts of things. Easy listening, like I said, nothing too deep. Some of these prints are really difficult to see on. See where I've quilted before. And there's a cat hair. Let's get rid of that. So just in case you are just tuning in, this is a live and unscripted quilting episode. It is aired as a live stream in real time while I'm working on a project. Everything's included. I think we did have one thread break today. That seems to be the most common one I mention. But it's done in real time, so you get to see how long things take, decisions that are made throughout, and some of my whys for the decisions that I make. So I aim to make this as helpful as I can, particularly for novice quilters. And we just had a thread break again. Speaking of it, I'm thinking it's bobbin this time. But let's check it out. Thread up. Don't you guys love all my Band-Aids? Do you want to hear the story behind them? I don't know if you do or not. I was actually at the doctor's this week because I had these areas on my hands that were not really warts, more like calluses, but I couldn't get rid of them. They wouldn't, sort of stay gone when I kind of cleaned them up. So anyway, she treated them for me with liquid nitrogen, as you are not surprised to learn. So now what I have is blisters. Holy smokes. So I'm sorry about that. That's maybe too much more information than you wanted, but That's why the Band-Aids on my hands. So, but hey, they still work. I can still make quilts. It's all good. So I am just, and Jennifer, who was asking about stopping and starting in the middle of a quilt, I'm backing up here. I'll kind of show you. I'm backing up to a point. A point is always where, even with your stitch regulator, your machine makes a couple of smaller stitches, which just helps to secure it at that point. So it's a good place to make your splice. And also it's easier to launch into the curve, you know, from a point rather than trying to maintain a beautiful curve from the middle of it. Does that make sense? So I almost always try to go back to a point. And I'm going to leave about 2 stitches after it. And I'm going to start my new stitching right in the point, anchoring the last 2 stitches and starting the new one. And then I drop my blue seam ripper right there so I can find where I was when I come back. And we'll go put our fresh bobbin in. And we'll oil while we're here. There is still a tiny tail on that bobbin, but it's wee tiny. As I described earlier, you get that little, on my winder anyway, I get that little crossover of the last few rotations on the bobbin, and they just don't feed off cleanly lots of times. You know what? Let's use our TOA gauge. We have one. Let's check our bobbin. Where is everybody? I can't see what you can see at the moment. Okay, I'm using my TOA gauge. For those who don't know what this gauge is, mine is exactly like the TOA, it's just branded Bernina. But you load your bobbin into its casing as you ordinarily would, and you put it into the gauge and it snaps into place. Then there's this little pulley system and a meter, and it's spring-loaded in there. So it's measuring how hard the pull is, and clearly something's wrong with this one because there's a really hard pull. Let's try that again. Load the bobbin. And I've heard from techs that it's important also that you hold this flat, that you don't, you know, for example, hold it up like this. It helps to get an accurate reading when it's fairly flat. So around that little pulley system, and I aim for 210 to 220 for my tension on my 40 weight thread. That's what my machine likes. So there we are, just a little over 200. Perfect. Cut the thread. Bobbin's good to go. So that's the beauty of the gauge. As I mentioned earlier in the show, there are plenty of quilters, I was one of them for years, that just checked how tight their bobbin tension was by dangling the bobbin in their hand. That works too, but this is a little more accurate because you have an actual number to attach to it. And remember, I was going to oil. I still am. I'm not going to forget. Can you see me better if I'm at the other end, Dave? You can't really see great at each end. Okay. So all I'm doing is I've got a fluffy brush. There's not much lint because I just cleaned it this morning and I'm using poly thread, but just in case, I'm taking a little bit of lint out. I'm exposing the little tiny tongue on my bobbin casing that I need to, not bobbin casing, what's the word I want? Anyway, there's a little spot that I oil on the Bernina. I put a little too much in there. There we go. Drop of oil. Put my plate back on. Load my fresh bobbin in. Close the bobbin door. We're in business. Now we go back to the blue seam ripper, which marks our resting point. See how handy that works? Are there a few questions? Okay, let's take a couple questions. I need a drink of water, so that would be a great little breather. There we go. Thea, with the thread being about the same color, how do you keep track of where you need to quilt? Thea, it is a little tricky on some of these prints, quite honestly. When I'm not on camera, I tend to manipulate my light, and most often my solution when it's hard to see is to turn off some of the overhead lights and have some side lights shining in, and it almost creates shadows where you've stitched, right? Because it's depressed. That makes it the most visible. So that's my go-to way for dealing with hard to see. This quilt is honestly not too bad in real life. It's maybe hard for you to see on camera, but it's not too bad as I'm working on it. Frugal Farm, what is the name of the quilting design? I call it Filaments. It is my own design. A little earlier in the show, my husband pulled up a photograph of what was my inspiration, which was a paper napkin. I have seen a similar design produced in digital pantographs too, so I didn't want you to think that I copied someone else's copyrighted design, but I took mine straight off a paper napkin. And I call it Filaments. And I do teach it in my monthly membership class called Advance. I break it down step by step and teach the actual process. Nancy, what a fabulous quilt. Love that design of quilting. It's now my go-to. Do you change your stitch length for different designs? Oh, great question, Nancy. By and large, when I'm doing edge-to-edge work, I do a 10 stitches per inch. It seems like a good standard neutral one. When I tend to change stitch length is if I'm doing something super, super fine. And it's usually when I'm doing custom quilting. So for example, bubbles or pebbles or a tiny stipple that's small, then a 10 stitches per inch tends to have, you know, jagged edges. And so then I might go as high as 12 or even 15 stitches per inch to get smooth curves with tinier stitches. But for my run-of-the-mill everyday quilting, I stick with 10 or 11. Yeah. Jackie, would a scoop foot be considered because of all the piecing? The great question, Jackie. I did talk about that briefly earlier, but I'll mention it again. And let me just get my spoon foot. For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, we might as well show it. So this is, let me see if I can get it in front of the red. I can't. You can kind of see that. It's shaped like a spoon. Some people call it a scoop foot. On my Bernina, it fits onto one of my presser feet. And the beauty of the curved edges then is it skates up over any bulky seam allowances or thickness. So I did consider it because it does help with going over these bulky seams. But you can see mine it's clear, but it's kind of a whitish and it's quite big around. It's more than an inch. I sacrificed quite a lot of visibility for that. So I chose to keep the visibility and just deal more carefully with the darning foot, which is what I've got on. I am having to coax those seams under the feet sometimes, but I'm able to see. I want to place my stitching right over those seam allowances. So this, to me, is better suited for a larger, less precise design. But I do love the spoon foot. That's a fact. Okay. Madge, experimenting with double batting. Love the look, but challenges with the magnet sticking leading to bloody toes. Suggestions? Stronger magnets? Are there any dual magnet systems? I've never used a dual magnet system, and Madge, I've had good success with the magnets on my bars. I'm not sure what to suggest other than you might want to consider the plastic C-clamps that fit over your bars. That might be an option with the double batting. Or what I have done sometimes with double bat, especially if I've got a quilt that's shifty and the two bat layers can tend to shift, is I will baste just one or two, 12-inch segments down. So it's not my whole quilt basted, but part of it basted. And then the magnets aren't as critical, right? Because I've got a basting line in front of me. Does that make sense? So it's like a partial baste, and that can be helpful too. I don't know a great solution to make those magnets stick if they're falling off. Ouch. I know what that feels like, so ouch. Gretchen, did I hear you say you were working with invisible thread? No, I'm not. I'm working with polyester thread, 100% polyester thread. I personally don't care for monofilament thread. It's even though it's come a long way in recent years in its development, it's usually nylon and it has a more stretchiness and it's just a different feel. It messes with your tension. In my experience, I have a hard time getting a pretty stitch. I have more thread breakage. I almost never use monofilament thread. A client has to just about hold me at gunpoint to get me to do that because it's difficult. So I prefer to just find a thread color that will work. Thea, I've been trying to sign up for the monthly and I keep getting an error 500 message. Would you mind emailing me, Thea, and we'll see if we can get that resolved. info@stitchedbysusan.com. Not sure what's happening there, but we'll get to the bottom of it for you. Okay, that's it for questions. You guys, let's go back to the blue seam ripper. Let's do another join here since this is a topic today. Okay, so we're seeing close up, yeah? Yeah, we are. So I left a couple of stitches in place after the point. I'm going to drop my needle now right at that point. Remember I was talking about visibility? This would be hard to do with the spoon foot on. If I had laser light, it would be easier, but I don't. So I've dropped my needle, taken one stitch, and that pulls up the bobbin thread. Now I'm going to take another one to get my top thread down through the hopper foot. Pull that through. Now I've got both thread tails in my hand. I'm going to endeavor to take 4 quick close stitches spaced over about 1/8 of an inch, but right over top of those previous stitches from the last thread, anchoring them in place and anchoring my new ones. Now I'll go ahead and stitch a little bit, and then I'll come back and clip the tails. So you can see it there. It's pretty unobtrusive. You know, you guys might see it close up on camera, but anyone looking at the finished quilt is never going to see that little splice. It's a very serviceable way and a pretty secure way to join your thread splices. Isn't this block pretty? A pineapple block done all in solids. You just don't see that very often. And again, I'm just traveling up to where I want to be. I see that I've got a lot of unquilted area up here. I don't want to quilt in front of it and get myself in an awkward position, so I just echoed all the way up to the top to fill it in. So by the questions that you're asking, it seems that some of you have not been here for the whole session, which is absolutely fine, but I'm going to repeat some of the information I gave earlier for those of you who are just coming in. I was talking about the fact that the membership for my online large course called a Freehand Quilting Masterclass is coming up in late October. So this Freehand Quilting Masterclass is full of designs similar to this one. This particular one is not in it because I had not yet started using it when I filmed that class, but designs similar in the sense that they are mostly edge to edge, so the same quilting from one edge to the other of the quilt. They're all freehand. And so in this masterclass, it was my goal to help you, to build a repertoire of designs that you can use for all kinds of quilts, baby quilts, teenager quilts, college age quilts, wedding quilts, all the things, guy quilts, feminine quilts, but also to really emphasize the process that I use for developing these freehand designs. You know, when I see an idea and I want to quilt it, how do I make sure that I'm able to repeat it over and over again? How do I make sure that I'm able to move around the quilt top with it? All those things. Plus some of my favorite tools. There's just lots of stuff in there. So that enrollment will be opening up for a group of students in late October. I only open it twice a year because I like to walk through the class with that group of students. And as a support, I offer weekly live question and answer sessions. So everyone then is receiving the material. There's no deadline, so you don't have to be doing all the quilting, but everyone's receiving the material at the same time, and I'm able to answer questions and help you walk through it. So that's coming up in late October. Leading up to it, I'm doing a few things that will let you know if this style of quilting is for you and just kind of get you immersed in the type of quilting that I do. And one of them is, starting next week, I'm going to be on YouTube Live each and every day for just a small chat about something quilting related, something that I'm currently working on, maybe a challenge in the quilt I'm working on, all those sorts of things. And so that's going to start next Monday, which I think we've decided is the 25th of September. Of course, I don't have a calendar in front of me, so I'm not positive on that one. Anyway, live every day. And then in October, I'll be offering a free workshop as well. So be on my newsletter to get the information on the dates for that workshop and the sign-up forms. And of course, I'll be publishing it on social media as well. So you shouldn't have any trouble finding that information. I have found over the years, each quilter has their own love, their own niche, the style of quilting that really, really appeals to them. And for me, it is this edge-to-edge type of work. It's practical, but I love to show that it can be beautiful. And this quilt is a great example of that. It is a stunning quilt. It's a quilt that has a lot of work in it. It's special. But that does not mean that it has to have $500 of custom quilting to retain its specialness, right? It can still be very, very beautiful with what we've traditionally thought of as just an edge-to-edge. So I aim to show one quilt at a time. Edge-to-edge quilting can be absolutely stunning too. Live and unscripted episodes like today, we try to air them twice a month. And most often they will feature a project from beginning to end. So right from loading, through the decision making about the batting and thread, etc., through the quilting, and hopefully to the end. Today's quilt, because I saw that it was a larger quilt and it wouldn't be practical to finish the whole thing in one sitting, I went ahead and started it. It was about half quilted last night or this morning early. And so then we're doing the ending part of the quilt this time. So we've covered basting on the sides, some tips for squaring up a quilt, for dealing with perhaps some bias or stretched edges, even for working with difficult fabrics. The background of this, the aqua that I'm quilting on right now, is a linen blend. So it's a little bulkier, and it's got more sort of give than a cotton does. It's a little bit stretchy. So you just have to pay attention to keep it smooth and flat. We're almost finished, folks. There's about a 7 or 8 inch wide chunk at the bottom here. So this is your last chance to get in your questions. I would be happy to answer any questions about this quilting project. I didn't even have to take my side clamps off for that little roll. I did take this one off before I realized that. And this is the tricky one to get back on, isn't it? That was silly to take it off. Tell you what, in the interest of time, let's just put our 2 clamps on here. Anyway, last opportunity to get in your questions. I'll do a quick run through again of my equipment that I'm using, so you don't have to ask those questions. I'm stitching on a Bernina Q24. 24 just means that's the throat space, the 24 inches. It is a large machine, that is for sure. I love having the availability of that large throat space. So Bernina Q24, I've got just a regular universal needle on it in a size 90-14. And I'm using Isocord 100% polyester thread in a super pale aqua. And I have the same thread loaded on the top and the bobbin. Bernina machines do have bobbin winders built in. So if you were watching earlier, you saw me grab a new bobbin off the side of my machine and set another one loading. What else can I tell you? My loading system, you're kind of seeing the edges of it here right in front of me, is the red snapper system. I absolutely love that for loading my quilts. And I did not show the beginning loading portion today, but in many of my episodes I do, and certainly in my last Live and Unscripted, which was the Friendship quilt, the loading portion is shown in that, so you can see those red snappers at work and how truly quick they are. I can load most quilts, even a queen size, in 10 minutes time, maybe even less. So really fast, quite accurate. They work well. I'm going to take a moment and give a few credits again for those of you who are just tuning in. My husband is Dave. We affectionately call him Mr. Producer. He doesn't love that nickname, but I just couldn't think of a better one, because he's manning all the things, all the wires and cables and cameras and etc. So a huge thanks to him. I sure do appreciate it. I know you guys do too. So many of you express that. And then our son Will does the voices that we always have at the introduction. Today I think it was a Frenchman. And then our good friend Dan Unger, who allows us to use his beautiful guitar music as the sort of backdrop for all this quilting. It's so relaxing and inspirational music. We just love it. And then last but not least, I do have a little option for support at a website called buymeacoffee.com/stitched by Susan. You are able to support this channel there with something as simple as a $5 one-time donation or a $5 a month membership. And so many of you have been really generous with your support. And all of that support goes straight into improving our equipment for this show. So at the end of the show, we will be rolling credits. And the names of the regular supporters are on those credits because we appreciate you so much. We are always striving to improve, and you know, we still see things that need improvements. So I know there's still some wobble in the camera. That's just an ongoing, every time we find something new and try it, we cheer. But it's an ongoing thing with a huge machine like this and the vibration that's in it. That is one of our challenges, is to try and get a not vibrating view for you. So we'll keep working at it. This quilt belongs to my client and friend. Her name is Jane, and it is mostly a pattern called the Penny Sampler, and I've put a link in the show description for the name of the designer as well. I can't remember it off the top of my head, I'm sorry. But Jane also put her own spin on it with some of the blocks that she added with her own and her husband's interests, so that this quilt would feature the things that they love. This is the area, I don't know if you recall, that I was pushing up a little bit when I was basting. And so now I'm just trying to even out that excess fabric that I pushed in here so that I don't get any pleats, but rather it just gets eased in, and no one will know when it's all said and done. The very ending part of a quilt, the last little pass like this, because you're limited in your movements, you know, in where you can go next, this is where I try to use my peripheral vision to gauge where I've been and to try to keep my loops from all going in the same direction, right? So I could have finished this bottom edge a wee bit sooner when I was quilting over here, but I opted to come back to it so that I would get loops, you know, angling in a different direction. And it doesn't always work out quite the way I hope, but it all seems to look good in the end. But that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to think of that as I move around the quilt, that I purposely keep randomizing the direction in which I'm moving. Look at this little Christmassy print with the tiny lights. I'll get back to it in a moment. Super cute. Right here. Look at those cute little lights. Just adorable. You can perhaps hear in the motor noise, I'm slowing down a little bit here. I again have some fairly thick seams, the corners of this square, and I'm just trying to actually make my stitching go over those seams, stitch them down securely so that they don't stick up like a button on my finished quilt. And really the basic shape that I'm quilting here, as you see, is just like a cursive L or E. And a quilt like this is an awesome way to practice your control and the gracefulness of your shapes, because you're quilting hundreds of these L's, and so it's a great time to practice the consistency, the smoothness, the curvature. And if there's any part of it that you're struggling with, focus on that one part, and over the hundreds of repetitions, I'm pretty confident it'll get better for you. I truly do think that just in the course of everyday quilting like this, that you can learn all the skills you need to know to then go and do more fussy, more advanced custom quilting. If you will do this type of quilting, this everyday quilting with intention, you know, when you see that your curves are not, you know, your bubbles aren't round perhaps, don't just keep on whipping them out at a great rate, but think about it and see where you can improve that and what you can do to make it a little bit different. And with that sort of intentionality and focus, it will get better and better and better. And because there's repetition in it, it will get better. I promise. One last call for any questions. As you see, we're nearing the last little corner here. So if you have anything you want to ask about this project, now is the time. Once again, if you have enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up. Click the subscribe button and click the bell. If you want to see future episodes, YouTube will let you know. And especially this upcoming couple of weeks, because I'll be coming on live every day with some quilting related topics. And if you're live there, you're welcome to ask questions as well. If you have any topics you'd like to see me talk about, let me know. Probably the best way would be via email, info@stitchedbysusan.com. Some of you have done that already, and I've incorporated those topics into my ever-growing list of things to talk about. So, and there we are at the end, a few close stitches, and we are complete. One more quilt, ready to be used and loved. Yay! Okay, more questions, comments, thoughts? I don't have a screen, huh? Oh, water's so good. Look at my cute mug. Diane and Selena sent me this water receptacle. So lovely. Mandy, do you ever use glide thread by Habdash? That's the only one my domestic likes when free motioning. Does your machine prefer a certain type of thread? I have used glide, and I like that thread very, very well. I do love a 100% polyester thread for machine quilting, because you're making a lot of stitches, and anything that's got cotton content in it, even cottonized polyester, creates so much lint. So I do love 100% poly thread. I have a good source for the Isacord. I have a wholesale account, and I love all their colors, so I have chosen to use that one, but there's other brands. Glide is one, Wonderfill is another. There's several great brands of poly thread. Joan. Okay, Joan, apparently I'm supposed to tell you, get off the charger and get driving. Dave says you'll understand. He's like passing messages now over my YouTube channel. You know, whatever. It's like CB radios, only YouTube channels now. Okay, I missed Joan's question for all that nattering. Sorry. Joan is asking, do you quilt over the trim spot? I find that the quilting thread ravels in those cases. Which trim spot do you mean, Joan? Where I trimmed the earlier quilting thread? I do quilt over that. I overlap usually about 1/4 inch, if that's what you're meaning by the trim spot. Sandal, I notice you don't quilt off the quilt. Is that intentional, or do you sometimes quilt off the top? It's actually intentional. I don't want to make too long of an answer. People who do digital quilting, myself included, often overshoot it because you don't want to fall too short and get awkward edges on it, and then that just gets trimmed off, and they tell me that does okay. But when I'm freehand quilting and I have the option, I prefer to have my threads, my ends secured. I don't want to just have cut thread ends all over the edges of my quilt. Does that make sense? So I do try and keep my quilting inside my basting area so that there's no sort of raw ends of that thread that are apt to come unraveled. It seems to me a good safeguard. That's my reasoning. Elaine, is the material and the chat sessions available to previous masterclass students? So the course material all is. It never expires. You can go back into it as many times as you want to. And the Q&A sessions remain up for about 6 months till I enroll the next knot of students. If you want to email me about that, I often make it available for past students to come to the current Q&A sessions, if that makes sense. It just involves putting you on an email list, and then you get notifications of when they are. So if you've missed them in the past and want to get involved in them, let me know. info@stitchedbysusan.com. I can answer the questions for you. Joan, I meant where the quilt edge will be trimmed. Joan asked, do I stitch over it? My stitching just falls within that 1/4 inch or almost 1/4 inch basted edge. So as you saw me ending my quilting at the very end, I just took I kind of scribbled, did a few stitches over. I feel like that's securing the threads, and it's not going to get trimmed off because I'm going to trim outside of that. You know, it's just beside the basting. Does that all seem clear as mud? Susan, do you have a place on your website to submit quilts for quilting? I don't right now, Susan, just because I'm limiting the amount that I take in. Again, if you want to email me, and if it's edge to edge, that's the only type of quilts that I'm taking right now, and I was just getting too many, so I removed that button. Feel free to email me, info@stitchedbysusan.com, and we'll talk. Doris, have you ever attached the binding on your long arm? Yes, I have, Doris. It works pretty well. It works pretty well. In my masterclass, actually, that's one of the little bonus modules that comes with it, because it's not really quilting, but I do have a pictorial walkthrough of how to do that at the long arm machine. Selena, smiling about the cup. Awesome! Madge, once again, a wonderful session. I get that little endorphin rush when you finish. Yay! Always grateful for the learning. Thanks, Madge. You have been a faithful supporter, and I appreciate that. And Elaine, I enjoy quilting along with you. Your voice is soothing, and I feel like I have a quilting coach. Awesome. That's my goal. That's my goal. I missed having someone to quilt with. And, you know, we can't really go back and forth to each other's long arm houses and quilt together, right? And so this is the next best thing. So thanks you all for joining me. It has been a real pleasure. Once again, I would appreciate a thumbs up and a subscribe, and click that bell if you want to get future episodes, in particular the live episodes that will be coming very much starting next week, and every day I'll be coming on air live and chatting about something quilt related. You can ask your questions there, and we'll keep in touch in that way, and we will be back in October for some more live and unscripted. So until next time, happy stitching.